The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome you all to the second EBPA policy webinar of the year. Today's topic will be about outcome funds. My name is Matteo Mascolo. I'm the Public Affairs Manager at the European Venture Philanthropy Association, and I will be moderating the webinar. Before we dive into the topic of today's webinar, let me walk you through some technical aspects. Throughout this session, you will be able to open or hide the control panel, which is the console that appears on the right-hand side of your screen. Please note that the control panel automatically collapses when it's not being used, but you can keep it visible via the view menu on the top. In the Join Audio section of the control panel, you should tick the option microphone or speakers, and if you're joining the webinar through internet. If you're using the telephone rather than the VoIP, you must choose telephone and use the PIN code provided in the confirmation you received when you registered for this webinar. You can also see the PIN on this slide. If you happen to have any technical issues, please don't hesitate to call EBPA and get in touch with my colleague Gianluca Gaggiotti. You can also find his contact on this slide. Given the high level participants to today's session, we will be keeping the participants to the webinar muted in order to avoid noise interferences, but we really encourage you all to raise any question you might have. If you do have a question, please write it in the question section of the control panel at any point during the webinar. Please do not forget to clearly mention to whom you would like to address it. The last part of today's webinar will consist of an interactive question and answer session, during which we will address your question to the panelists. If for some reason your question has not been answered during the webinar, feel free to contact us via email afterwards and we will ensure the necessary follow-up. You can also use that question section to let us know about any technical problems you might experience. Last but not least, note that this section is being recorded, so you will be able to watch the recording and consult this presentation as of next week on EBPA website. Now that the housekeeping details are clear, let me give you a quick word about the European Venture Philanthropy Association. EVPA is a membership organization currently gathering more than 220 members from all across Europe that are interested in or are practicing venture philanthropy and social investments. Our members include foundations, social investors, academics, financial institutions, and service providers. Our policy and public affairs work rely on two pillars. First, in our role as a thought leader, we act as a counterpart for the institutions of the EU by being the voice of the sector, communicating the concern and expectation of our members to European policymakers. Doing so will lead the discussion and shape the debate. We also spot and discuss key topics of interest to our sectors, including relevant initiatives undertaken by the EU. Second, in our role as a catalyst, we bring together different actors in conversation and collaboration in order to increase mutual understanding, shared value, and impact. We carry out initiatives that tap into the synergies between public and private sector and showcase best policy practices and inspirational success stories from our sector. We aim to inform, initiate interaction, and also inspire. Let me speak about the policy webinar series. The policy webinar series is a project we started in 2014 and through which we could reach more than 1,000 people. This series connects policymakers and practitioners in the venture philanthropy and social investment sector around topics of interest with a policy angle. As you can see, we've already addressed issues such as social impact bonds, public procurement, retail impact investing, or crowdfunding. If you're interested in these topics, all recording and presentation are available on our website. At the end of the webinar, a short survey will pop up on your screen. We will greatly appreciate if you could take 2 minutes to fill this in. It's also an opportunity to let us know about a specific policy topic you would like us to address in our policy webinar series, so don't hesitate to grab it. Now, Let me explain why we have decided to focus on today's topic and what we want to accomplish during this webinar. Outcome funds are currently receiving growing attention by the venture philanthropy and social investments community. This is because the framework in question changed the traditional approach where payments were made for outputs and not for outcomes, meaning regardless of the final social impact. Instead, outcome funds, by focusing on positive social outcomes, create a strong incentive for social purpose organizations to meet social goals and thus contribute to fostering social impact. Yet, from the point of view of the social purpose organization, this approach can be challenging. In fact, these funds, which can pay only after the targets are met, often require social purpose organizations to raise investment to operate. This aspect may indeed exclude small organizations, which often do not have the resources to finance themselves for long periods. In addition, specific policy incentives on outcome funds are lacking in new member states, and consequently, very few managers are creating these vehicles outside of the UK. There is therefore a need to promote dialogue and share knowledge about outcome-based funding interventions in order to better understand their pros and cons and how can help investors, social purpose organizations, and policymakers achieve their social goals. This led us to what we want to accomplish today. By the end of the webinar, all the participants will have a clear overview of what are outcome funds, understand where outcome funds are placed in the EU policy framework, which initiatives the European Commission and European Investment Funds are considering on the subject, what are the strengths and the weaknesses of these vehicles, what are the challenges to deploy outcome funds, and what are the opportunities these vehicles may offer to social investors, social enterprises, and governments. Now, let me walk you through our today's agenda. As you can see, today we will have four presentations. Ms. Georgia Efremova from the European Commission, DG ECFIN, will give us an overview of the EU policy framework on outcome-based financing and highlight initiatives of the European Commission on the topic. Mr. Philippe Bernard-Treille from the European Investment Fund will explain why there is appetite and need for innovative outcome-based financial products in Europe and what the European Investment Fund is cooking on this matter. Ms. Jane Newman, Director of Social Finance UK, will illustrate the history of outcome funds in UK and share direct experience on these innovative vehicles. Finally, Mr. Filipe Almeida, Director of Inovação Social Portugal, will share his lesson learned from establishing an outcome fund in Portugal. Our speakers will go through their presentation one after the other. There will be a question and answer session at the end of their presentation when we will have a chance to dive deeper into some of the issues by addressing to the speaker all of their questions. So please do not hesitate to write your question in the question panel so we can ask them during the final part of the webinar. Please do not forget to mention to whom you would like to address your question. And now I leave the floor to our first speaker, Ms. Georgia Efremova, Policy Officer at the European Commission, DG ECFIN, in charge of social impact investments. She will guide us towards the EU policy framework on outcome-based financing and will explain where outcome funds fit in the recent InvestEU program. Please, Georgia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much and good afternoon, everyone. So it's a pleasure to be here at the next DVPA webinar on outcomes-based finance and outcomes funds, which is, as we all know, at the leading edge of impact investing. For us, it is also very important. I would like to take you through three things today. The first is, Matteo, we cannot yet speak about the EU framework for outcomes funds or outcomes-based contracting, but I will let you know what the emerging or the newly established EU framework for impact investing is, so that we could later see how outcomes-based finance and the particular tool of outcome funds fit into that. So I'll give just a big picture of the emerging impact investing framework. Then I would take you on a mini historical tour, so like a historical taste of how our particular thinking on payment by results and outcome-based initiatives has progressed over the last 3 years. And then I would key into the new paradigm, that is the newly proposed InvestEU with its social window and what prominent role outcome-based finance will have in that new board game, let's say, that will come after 2021. So outcome-based finance has emerged and now is stabilized as a key element of the emerging impact investing framework. It is developed as an ecosystem approach, and it combined 3 main areas, so to speak. The first being a mix of financial tools, which we have developed over time. Firstly, under the EASY, Employment and Social Innovation Program, followed by the European Fund for Strategic Investments, which was launched under the Investment Plan for Europe in 2015. So a mix of financial tools, which are targeting specialized financial intermediaries, such as ethical and alternative banks, microfinance vehicles, social impact funds, social business angels, etc., and social economy enterprises in different market segments. Now, up to date, in the last 3 years, we have developed a mix of 6 facilities, which were jointly developed by the European Commission and our implementing partner for these facilities, the European Investment Fund, from whom you will have the pleasure to hear right after me. So the EIF holds the mandate for implementation in the current MFF for these financing tools. The second stream are an array of capacity building and market development actions. So notably under the easy technical assistance and various grant actions to support the demand and supply side of the social finance market, we have launched a transaction cost support mechanism for equity vehicles targeting early stage social enterprises. And then more recently, and probably more relevant to today's topic, is the recently dedicated capacity building advisory platform under the EIA, the European Investment Advisory Hub, but I'll explain more about this later. The third stream of the EU Impact Investing Framework is a broader action on stimulating enabling conditions or enabling environment for sustainable finance. Here, notably, I could mention the EU Sustainable Finance Initiative and the recently published Action Plan on Sustainable Finance, as well as the Commission's participation in the global movement, for instance, the Global Steering Group for Impact Investing, which also places central focus on the development of social impact bonds, initiatives in the broader social outcomes market. So this is it in a nutshell. Now, to offer a brief historical reflection on the past 3 years, because Commission's social finance tools are relatively recent, I would say that the focus on impact and outcomes was, of course, inherent in the first EU social entrepreneurship instruments we developed in 2015 under the EASY. So these were guaranteeing instrument for social enterprise finance. And then later, in 2016, we developed a set of equity pilots under the FC equity product. And notably there, we do have already a payment by results facility, which was launched in 2016. And offers investment into social impact bonds funds and vehicles supporting the carrying out and management of social intervention activities during the implementation of the contracts and the social impact bond schemes. I am sure that this will be very well covered in the next presentation, so I won't say more than what our thinking was at the outset. So we first developed this PBR instrument as an additional tool for social enterprise finance and stimulating inclusion-focused intervention. So as such, it was a milestone instrument. We had a noteworthy transaction in Finland and already a year ago, and several more transactions in a pipeline which is becoming ever more robust thanks to the efforts of the EIF colleagues again. You'll hear more about this later. Now, importantly, in the course of implementation of this payment by results instrument, and given the rising interest and requests to the Commission for more support on the side of different social stakeholders and local development actors, we gained gradually a recognition of social outcomes contracting as real catalyst for social and place-based innovation and sustainable change management processes. So it was not just pure social enterprise finance anymore. It was a much broader shift in thinking. And so we recognize that we need additional efforts to develop the awareness and willingness of stakeholders, particularly on the side of public authorities and commissioning bodies. And thus, a second step was taken, and this is EU capacity building actions in support of payment by results and social outcomes contracting. So there, in January 2018, we had a convening exercise for some of the most advanced practitioners on social impact bonds and social outcomes contracting across Europe in an ECFIN EIB group social outcomes workshop held in Luxembourg, which explored social outcomes contracting as potential vehicles for effective public service provision, and asked what EU-level support may be needed to support and trigger market development for social outcomes contracting. So a number of these EU actions were identified. Firstly, the establishment and facilitation of communities of practice from among experts and practitioners from the public and private sector of different member states. Then secondly, programs of awareness raising and support for the development of templates of contractual documentation. Here I should note using more of a framework rather than standardized template models, aiming to showcase the flexible contracting and procurement approaches. Many regional cross-border networks are already working on developing common methodologies. And in the second stream, I would say that importantly, case studies are needed of what works and what doesn't, given the experience of the early pioneers or adopters, such as the Portuguese case, about which we'll hear later. So these learnings, recommendations, and improvements have to be further mainstreamed. We know, and we want to take action on it. The third element was a data analysis stream. So reviewing publicly available data held by the European Commission, such as Eurostat and the Joint Research Center, as well as the OECD's impact investing stream in this area, to assess the potential to develop a refined data set that could be used in building evidence base and act as a convincing tool, if you will, for commissioners of impact for the opportunities offered by social outcomes contracting. So outcome funds were also identified as a further milestone in our capacity building actions, most likely in the years after 2020, as of course some time is needed, and there will also be possibilities arising from the new financial architecture of the next MFF, which I will touch upon next. So we do have a social impact platform covering these elements I have just mentioned in the process of being developed under the European Investment Advisory Hub, as I said, which will run in the next few years, preparing or pre-paving the new MFF. I should also say that under FC2, so the second investment period of the European Fund for Strategic Investments, we have a strengthened focus on social innovation, social outcomes finance, service delivery, and social enterprise finance. Now, what happens next? So all eyes seem to be on 2021. We have a long way to go to there, but we are in intensive preparations. So let me tell you in brief what the future holds, or especially the future contained under the new Invest EU regulation, and how this could be a new paradigm for EU social investments with outcomes-based financing at its heart. Next slide, please. So the InvestEU will be a single investment EU support mechanism. It's a 38 billion euro fund underpinned by a single budgetary guarantee from the European budget. of 14.2 billion. It will serve as both a policy and delivery tool. It was recently presented on June 6th from the Commission. The rationale includes significant efficiency gains, cost effectiveness of fees, given single agreements to be signed with different implementing partners. Now here, probably noteworthy is the novelty of foreseeing a mix of implementing partners from among financial intermediaries and international financial intermediaries, as well as national and promotional banks and institutions. That is, relying on the more specialized geographical and sectoral knowledge of an array of partners, given the important aim of geographical balance for this next single investment tool. It also implies a much stronger role for the Commission in the governance and management of the investment facilities, which is, again, another important shift from the current approach. What delights me most is that this is a policy-driven approach, and here we can notice a significant shift from investment volumes that we had in the current period under the investment plan for Europe. So a shift from investment volumes and numbers to policy objectives and impact. So recognition of the importance of the smaller project that could bring greater societal values. So the fund the whole fund will follow a policy-driven approach, and it will be implemented through 4 thematic policy windows. These are research and innovation, sustainable infrastructure, SMEs, and, drumroll, social investments and skills policy window. It's a most notable development for integrated policy and delivery to investment in the social sector. And again, social outcomes financing is of central focus here. Now, a last characteristic of this single investment mechanism is the blending. You'll notice why it's important for us. So blending and the harmonized combination rules for synergies and complementarities between EU and member state action. Why is it important for outcome funds? Now, the InvestEU proposal foresees so-called member state compartments into each policy window. This involves the voluntary contribution of European structural funds allocation to underpin the provisioning of an EU guarantee, which will be used to develop different financial instruments, ring-fenced financial instruments, that is with precise geographical and sectoral scope to target the local needs and specificities in member states. And thinking ahead, since social investments are particularly implicated by cohesion funds, the establishment of outcome funds could actually be done as one of the elements under the member states' cohesion compartments. This, of course, subject to much further discussions, planning, elaborations, and collaboration, but it could be the one significant shift, let's say, allowing for this to become not just a single development by one member state, but something available to each and every member state. Now, briefly about the social investment window, which is one of the 4 policy windows. It's a 4 billion euro guarantee, which is expected to mobilize 40 billion of investment into the social sector. With a special aim to develop and consolidate the nascent market structures underlying the European social economy ecosystems. We will have integrated investments under this window. We'll have integrated investments into social infrastructure, social services, human capital and skills, innovation, microfinance, social economy. Noteworthy is also to say that social investments will be mainstreamed under the 4 legs of the InvestEU program, because it's a program of which only the first part is the fund. So we have the InvestEU fund with 4 policy window. Then we have an advisory platform, so a single technical assistant pocket for implementation of financial instruments. It's of the size of 500 million. We have an InvestEU InvestEU portal, which is a central meeting place of project promoters and investors, resembling the European Investment Project portal we have today, but much enhanced. And blending, as I mentioned, through the cohesion or member state compartments. Last note is that one of the new strategic initiatives in the next MFF and in frame of the social investments window is the European Union partnership with foundations and philanthropic actors. So here we're beginning to talk about broader blending of different sources of public funding, okay, but also philanthropic and commercial capital to deliver on sustainability and social inclusion objectives. I don't know how I'm doing with time, but probably in the remainder, I would like to now focus on outcomes-based finance and just locate it somehow in the proposals. So in the InvestEU regulation, it is sprinkled over in the recitals and in different provisions. But you will notice we have an annex on the eligible and strategic sectors to be targeted by the policy windows. So area number 11, which is for social investment, identifies specifically the promotion of social outcome schemes and mechanisms as one of the particular social investment focuses. In the impact assessment underpinning the social investment window, published as a staff working document, we have a particular discussion of outcome funds established to pay for outcomes achieved by social impact bond-like schemes as one of the key elements or trigger points to drive the market, given some of the values of market development, transition to sustained programmatic approaches, price discovery, etc. So the various benefits of outcome-based outcome fund structures that will be touched upon, Jane. We are in the process of developing the investment guidelines that will further elaborate the different financing tools and structures under the various windows. For the social window, social outcomes contracting, as well as outcome funds, will be particularly delineated, along with other social impact incentive mechanisms, or mechanisms that could be alternatives. So I stop here, and in summary, I guess I would say our thinking is evolving, our interest is strong, and we are. I'm delighted actually to listen to the presentation and see where the market is moving and how it could act for catalyst to our own thinking and EU action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Efremova, for this comprehensive overview. We will now explore the topic from a different perspective. Our next speaker, Mr. Philippe Bernard-Treille, investment manager at the European Investment Fund, will talk about why there is a growing need for outcome funds in Europe and how the launch of outcome funds will facilitate the provision of additional social outcome contracts in Europe. Please, Philippe, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Matteo. I would like here to thank the EVPA for this opportunity to talk about this topic of outcome funds. And I would like also to say good afternoon to everyone. And I will try to keep you awake during this afternoon. After lunch is always difficult to stay awake. So let's go for this interesting topic regarding the outcome funds. I think first of all, I would like just to introduce what we do at EF in terms of impact on slide number 3. You will see the various elements and business line that we have. 3 of them are financed by FC, and which is the so-called Juncker plan. So you see that we have a program for incubator and accelerator of social startup. We can do also co-investment with business angels. We have also social impact funds from the social impact accelerator, where we have invested in Bridges social bond funds, and also this payment by result investment scheme, what we called the social outcome contract. I will not call them during the presentation social impact bonds, because actually they create quite often confusion when we talk with the public sector, and particularly with cabinet of governments. So it's better to talk, because when they see finance, they say, okay, it's finance. It's particularly with local authorities. It's finance, and therefore, it's not really for us, or we don't really understand. While if you talk about social outcome contract, they see clearly partnership, and therefore partnership is very interesting for them. So on slide 4, of course, today we see clearly some declines actually in public budget, and in parallel we see increase in social needs. So that means that basically we need to develop new methodologies. We need to innovate further. We need to find basically solutions to tackle social issues, and bringing actually the private sector in that segment actually enable quite often the best in social delivery. So what's particularly for vulnerable groups, and we see social outcome contracts an interesting tool to do so. Indeed, we see that there is clearly a need of a partnership between the public and the private sector. Of course, this will not replace what the public sector does in the social economy, but will clearly complement it, and will try to contribute to find actually new innovative solution in the delivery of social intervention. So it's governments are really paying a lot of attention to that instrument, because it's clearly a visible element. It's very visible instrument where they see that the creativity, the new methodology in delivering an intervention, and also the results-oriented approach that the private sector bring is something interesting for them, because the governments ultimately will only pay for the pre-agreed outcomes, and therefore will only buy impact units, something which is evident and real. So here behind that, basically, when you discuss with various governments, they say that it's an allocation of taxpayer money in a great way. So that's why actually they want to test this new model for social delivery. Next slide, you will see that how a bit the market, the EU market, is evolving. Of course, the UK is super well advanced in regards to social outcome contracts. They have developed outcome funds, and we'll see how this has enabled actually the market in the UK to grow. So I would like just really to emphasize that social outcome fund is really needed actually to develop. Can you move to the next slide, please? Hello. Oh, yeah. Then we sorry. Previous slide. Sorry for that. Yeah, thank you. So so we see UK is very well advanced, as I mentioned. We see also quite nice development actually in the Nordics. We see some provision of social outcome contracts in Finland. Denmark is also going in this direction with some projects, evangelistic projects in the pipeline at the moment. Sweden is also looking at how they could work with social outcome contracts. In Europe, Central Europe, let's say France, Belgium, and Germany have some good developments in 2017. In Italy as well, there are some currently quite interesting projects as well. We all know that Portugal has tested social outcome contracts, and we'll have a presentation later on. And we see also in CE actually Poland. Poland will also have a look at social outcome contracts, and let's say so that means that overall there is a clear appetite for local authority, central governments, to develop this concept. The issue is that we see clearly budget constraints at local authority level, and therefore and this ultimately limits the number and the size of social outcome contracts. So let's say if you launch, and why that, of course, because we try to transfer knowledge. One of the elements that the European Investment Fund is doing at the moment with regard to social outcome contracts is to try, and together with other colleagues and counterparts, is to help actually to understand how it works, and therefore, because we see that the product design and the learning curve of the various actors is quite limited at the moment. So we need absolutely to transfer the knowledge, to explain them that they have a lot of data available, and they would like clearly, and they should use this data to see where they could use social outcome contracts. And therefore, the setup of social outcome funds by national governments or even regional governments could support actually the development of social outcome contracts. These funds, though, they will provide funding to buy outcome, to buy impact units, and has the budget already available. This enables a faster provision of social outcome contracts, and then operating in the same vertical. Yes, we'll see later on why there is this let's say sector approach. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the governments were very keen on the use of the public money on taxpayer resources, and therefore allocating money to buy for existing outcomes makes completely sense. They will also contribute to simplify the social outcome process, because, as I mentioned earlier, this product design, on the learning curve of the public sector at the moment for local authorities is not there yet. So there is a lot of things to do here. Of course, when you set up an outcome fund, you need to make sure that you have the budget which is available for that, and the central government has to decide on the allocation of the budget. Of course, behind that, you have also the procurement process to launch these opportunities, and here we see that there is different legal framework in Europe regarding that, and therefore in some countries there is people sometimes use grants actually to avoid this procurement contract. But then when you pay for outcome, if you pay with grants, the mix of resources sometimes could create some issues, and also so the process can be quite long actually to launch a social outcome contract. So if you have a social outcome funds already here to test for pilots, because here we are talking about testing pilots and launching social outcome contracts in the form of pilots, so small size. Today we see mainly in Europe social outcome contracts between 0.5 million to 6, 7, 8 million. We have one in Finland, which is 14 million, but this is, let's say, it's the largest in Europe. It's quite exceptional, and it's a managed structure as compared to the intermediate structure or the direct structure. So, and it's not representing, let's say, the vast majority of the social outcome contracts in Europe. So, next slide, you will see what we see at the moment. It's typically what we see at the moment in Europe. Of course, this depends of the legal framework of each country, but we see clearly some small outcome funds could play a role. Here you see that there is, so it's a normal, let's say, social outcome contract, and I will not come back on that. You see payment barriers option 1 and option 2. Sometimes, because of the legal framework, the outcome fund can only pay the sector social organization and not directly the SPV. So we can actually replicate social outcome contracts in various countries, but I think in terms of the intervention, now in terms of the structure, of course, the legal framework of each country being different, we need to be quite creative. But of course, we must avoid any complexity when dealing with social outcome contracts. They're already, let's say, quite complex, and we should not add any complexity of that. So social outcome fund could actually simplify this process of launching this let's say intervention and the provision of the commissioning, let's say, of social outcome contracts. Next slide, you will see that basically a central outcome fund is needed actually for launching social outcome contracts. However, we see more and more often governments thinking to split this central outcome fund through compartments, or even dedicating outcome funds with special vertical. Of course, behind that, they have done the work on what will be needed, what is the cahier des charges, you know, what will be the prices that they want, what are the prices that they want to pay, and therefore there is an analysis that should be done at government level, and also according to each ministry level, and therefore dedicating an outcome fund per vertical actually enable a better acceptance by the social sector, and of course help to follow the political objectives. It's very important that these dedicated outcome funds are really focused on the results, and when you have, let's say, an outcome fund which is linked to a vertical, it's quicker to launch a procurement process, because they know exactly what is needed, you know, what are the price of the intervention that they do. So launching outcome funds dedicated to a special sector, we believe, and according to the vast discussion that we could have on the market, might make sense. Of course, it's not the sole element, but of course, national outcome funds could work as well. But we see more and more the government willing to have this approach. Then, of course, this next slide, please. We could also have outcome funds which could be complemented by other sources of funding. They of course they help let's say the government to participate to the development of social outcome contracts. This is social outcome funds really help governments to see to develop this market basically, but also as for a local authority, these outcome funds could be complemented by the budget of a local authority, and because when the local authority, when you discuss with the local authority, basically they want to try, you know, they have some appetite to innovate, but also they want to partner. They're happy to partner, let's say, with national governments, you know. So here, an outcome fund partnering with the local authority or using it or combining the two budgets could be very interesting. So they feel a bit safe, you know, with this information. So that's why also we could see that, and let's say they have the same kind of methodology. You know, we see a kind of a transfer of methodology from the national government to local authority. Of course, the governments want to achieve a positive political impact, and this helps to do so. On the next slide, of course, we see complementarity with the EU structural funds. However, because we see clearly an absorption issues at national and regional level, particularly in Eastern Europe, but also at regional level in France or in other countries, and the use of structural funds to mix with the government money actually could help the provision of social outcome contracts. But of course there is then here we are mixing different type of funding, and structural funds actually had some let's say challenges to be there, and we have a presentation on that regarding the Portugal, because we here actually sometimes to finance grants with grants actually an intervention, so a payment, so you mix grants with the financial instruments. Then also bear in mind that the structural funds in the previous MFF was only paying for the money which has been actually invested by investor, but they will not remunerate the risk of the equity risk that the investor was taking. So, and then also, so it was a bit difficult actually, or of course this could be complemented by a foundation or a donor, just paying for or remunerating the risk, or by a local authority budget. The ESF as structural funds, they have very strict rules, and therefore it's when we work with social outcome contracts, and particularly when you develop a market, you should make sure actually that you have enough flexibility, you know, particularly. So here was quite challenging, let's say, and also of course in terms also of duration. You know that social outcome contract, it can be quite long, and while on the SF side, let's say they have fixed duration. So, but I think my colleague Georgia has explained you that in the next MFF this will probably change, and therefore will probably provide the better framework for social outcome contracts. So this is I believe a strong opportunity that the European Commission is launching, and we welcome that, of course, a lot. Then, as a conclusion, I think outcome funds, they have demonstrated clearly their ability to speed up the development of social outcome contract. We have seen that in the UK. Let's bear in mind that launching pilots, and if we want to create this market, we don't need to have outcome fund of 1 billion euros, right? So just small funds, you know, in countries, just around 20 million, you know, 15 million. This is clearly enough to launch pilots, clearly enough to show that there is a market opportunity to test actually social outcome contracts. Of course, these outcome funds, they enable knowledge pools when particularly at vertical level, you know, at subsector level. If you have an outcome fund on education, the intervention, you know, the price of the outcome, how it is structured, this is something which is helpful for the sector. So I'm very happy that we see many governments currently brainstorming on setting up outcome funds at national level. We see particularly that in the Nordics, but also
Unmuted.
In South Europe. So EIF is clearly committed to help the market to be developed, and will participate as an investor through with FC to finance the social intervention. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Mr. Bernard Reye, for this detailed explanation and for sharing with us the vision of the European Investment Fund on outcome funds. I would like to remind to all the participants that, if they want, they can already start writing the question in the panel. Our next speaker will give us even more insight on the topic. Ms. Jane Newman, Director of Social Finance UK, will tell us what are the differences between social impact bonds and outcome funds, and how outcome funds have evolved in the UK market. Please, Ms. Newman, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Matteo, and hello everybody. I think that the first two sets of comments set up this conversation really well. I suppose one question is why the UK experience, why is that relevant? And perhaps the introductory observation is that the experience of outcome funds in the UK that I'm going to lay out did lead into informing the both the launch and design of the Portuguese fund several years ago. We had some small input on that. Also, an outcomes fund in Colombia, and also multiple initiatives that are currently under development in the international development field. So there's a working group of 23 donors that are looking at outcomes funds and how they could take commissioning to scale in a cost-efficient way. So just look at a snapshot of the UK market and how impact bonds have grown over. This is a picture as at the end of 2017, when there were 35 impact bonds. There's about 40 now. And I've highlighted at the bottom that the 6 outcome funds that have been behind the volume of activity in the UK. And I think this that illustrates, I think, neatly why this is an interesting. If you're interested in commissioning for outcomes and using social finance instruments to fund that, why outcomes funds might be a useful tool to have to shape the market. So outcomes funds themselves sit within a wider landscape of commissioning. In the international development field, cash on delivery aid and results-based instruments have been around for a long time. What they don't have necessarily is the ability to provide working capital finance for organisations to be able to access that. And similarly, in the UK and in other markets, payment by results for public service sector commissioning is reasonably widely understood and experienced, but all of those create a problem for organisations that want to finance and either don't have the resources to fund themselves and wait to be paid, or there is some risk to whether or not the intervention would be successful in the way everyone expects, and what is the fair balance of risk there. So that is what led to impact bonds or social outcomes contracts, or as we prefer actually to call them, social impact partnerships. And outcomes funds are the next logical progression of that, because they take a deal-by-deal approach, which for those of us who have engaged in the field know that that's an intensive activity, and they turn it into a more programmatic approach. So outcomes funds themselves evolved out of our early work actually around impact bonds. So when we first started work way back, we looked at 3 social issue areas as a potential area for a social impact partnership or impact bond. And that was recidivism, of course, that led to the Peterborough bond. Children's services, particularly children at the edge of care, that subsequently led to quite a volume of transactions in the UK, none of which actually has an outcome fund attached to it, but created efficiencies in different ways because of the transferable learnings that it was possible to take from transaction to transaction. And the third area that we were very excited by, but couldn't progress, was recovery from addiction. And the problem there was not that there aren't very good programs that could be implemented and that outcomes are not a good way to incentivize those. The problem was what we call the wrong pockets problem, that the benefits of effective recovery from addiction was spread very widely across multiple budgets and at different levels of government. So that made it hard for any one person or budget holder to commission it, either because he didn't have enough money to pay for it and the benefit was falling elsewhere, or because it's impossible to bring all the budget holders together to commission together. So that led us very early on to recognize that there needed to be some kind of centralized support as the more practical way to help address that. At the same time, our Department of Work and Pensions thought that the outcomes approach to commissioning programs in the workforce development or youth employment space would be an interesting way to to test the effectiveness of multiple different interventions using the same kind of pricing structure. And that has led to a version of an outcome fund, which you might call it also a sort of commissioning platform, which has also shaped the experience in the UK. But we learned so much by what didn't go well at the beginning, actually. So we assumed with our early work that the governments would be attracted to impact bonds and outcomes-based commissioning because of the risk transfer that they implicitly include. But we realised as we worked that governments don't always see risk being transferred. In fact, sometimes they see them as being even more risky because they demonstrate failure when they don't pay, or there's a risk that they might pay out too much. We also felt that there was they would lead to a more sustainable form of funding. But it's also true that in the UK, no impact bond, I think, so far has been sustained beyond the end of its life. So we didn't get that right either. And the other assumption we made was that that with larger scale transactions, this is back to the previous slide, please. Back there. We assumed that costs would reduce with size, but what we found was that size was limited by the size of the counterparty, and that really led us to the light bulb moment. There was a need for to move from a deal-by-deal approach to a more market-based approach, a programmatic mechanism, and that is really where outcomes funds have come to life. And from our perspective, what we had seen in the UK is that they do look to be the means by which impact bonds and outcome-based commissioning could achieve scale. So move on. So they have been described well, I think, by Philippe. But in essence, at the heart of an outcomes fund is the ability to pay for multiple projects from the same budget. We have sort of described the examples in the UK as falling into two broad types of fund: a thematic fund built around a particular issue area, or a so-called innovation type fund, which is where you could have outcome funding provided for social outcome contracts across a whole range of different areas, where you're really inviting your local government or communities or people who bid into that to propose different and alternative ways of tackling different problems. Moving on. So moving on. Before I talk about the different funds that have emerged in the UK, I should just deal with some sort of terminology. So thematic outcome funds are around particular social issue areas. Innovative, as I said, could be around multiple different issue areas, but are really promoting new ways of doing things. And then there is a distinction between partly paying for outcomes and wholly paying for outcomes. So the Portuguese fund wholly pays for outcomes, and the thematic funds in the UK have wholly paid for outcomes. In our innovative examples in the UK, they have partly paid for outcomes. They have operated as a top-up for local government. So we have 6 outcome funds in the UK that have been, or 6 boxes here, but it's actually 7, because there's a new in development. And I've coded these by the different descriptions. But what we have really found is that the early examples of co-funding and top-up outcome funds, the innovation outcome funds, when we first started, when the government first started with those, there was an assumption, I think, that a substantial amount of government money which could contribute to local government commissioning for outcomes would produce a lot of demand. What we found in practice is that a lot of knowledge development and sort of technical contracting expertise and skills support is needed in order to do that. But when we moved more recently to the Life Chances Fund, which was a substantial allocation of budget, which is contributing between 20 and 30% of the outcome funding across a whole range of different issue areas. The experience of the early funds has been translated into that fund, particularly around the amount of financial support that commissioners and local government need in order to be able to put their proposals together. So the process pipeline for that has generated a volume of transactions which, in terms of their depth and breadth, are very different to the early experience. And I think that the important thing that we have learnt in the UK is that there is an enormous amount of learning by doing in the way outcome funds are set up. So the thematic outcome funds started in 2013 with our Department of Work and Pensions Innovation Fund, which was really setting out a set of outcomes. Some of the outcomes were very more like outputs, and some of them were soft as opposed to hard outcomes. But they set up what they called a rate card, which was a menu of outcomes that they were willing to pay for, and they were interested in different ways of delivering against that rate card. And that has produced a really interesting body of learning, firstly about the pricing of outcomes, and pricing outcomes partly for the cost of delivery, but also how to incentivize different activities. So there has now been 3 rounds of funding around employability, youth employment outcomes. And if you look at the rate cards and the activities that have been incentivized across those, you see the benefit of learning, not only on the part of the organizations who bid into them, but also from the department in terms of exactly what it wants and exactly understand, or better understanding the issues that underlie that particular social problem, and how you might want to use a rate card and outcomes focus approach to incentivize activity. And that's been translated into programs in youth homelessness and rough sleeping as well. And perhaps the most interesting evolution that is starting to happen in the UK, it's still really very early days, is for local authorities to explore using outcomes funds at a local level, so crowding in different budgets around a particular place. So there is as I say, no one size fits all for outcomes funds, because they're really a mechanism to incentivize and force funding in a certain way. So just turning to the last slide, some of the benefits of outcome funds. I mean, really, I remember a conversation with a Dutch municipality who was really talking to me about having completed an impact bond, what happens next? Where does the learning go? The learning should translate into informing new policy. And I think that is an observation we've had across the piece, that because individual transactions don't always sustain beyond their life, there's a risk that you lose the learning. Whereas if you consolidate that into a fund that then is able to commission a second or third round of activity in a similar or adjacent area, you can really start to understand what it takes to make change and how to inform policy. Certainly around pricing and contracting expertise, consolidating the learning just makes sense. But the other interesting thing with outcome funds is that they can be used to shape policy. So the Life Chances Fund has been the recipient of something like 100 well-developed proposals. As it receives those proposals, it can look at across the piece and see things not only that it wants to fund on an individual basis, but where there's an opportunity to aggregate or encourage organisations or interventions to work on a combined basis. And I think that there's a real opportunity for outcomes funds in the future to do that kind of thing. So we just left there a note at the bottom of that particular last slide to a thought piece on our website, which captures some of these ideas in more detail. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much, Ms. Newman, for your insightful presentation. Our last speaker, Mr. Filipe Almeida, President of Portugal Inovação Social, will illustrate a unique outcome-based initiative in Portugal and its link with social impact bonds. Please, Mr. Almeida, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matthew. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much to EVPA for the invitation to be here. I'm very pleased to share this pioneer experience, this pioneer Portuguese experience of Portugal social innovation. We can call it like that, Portugal social innovation in English, no problem. So can we pass for the next slide, please? This was just an introduction for you to see how beautiful is our logo. Now, Portugal social innovation in brief words is a public government initiative that was created to develop the social investment markets and promote social innovation and social entrepreneurship in Portugal. It's actually a pioneer program within the member states. Portugal is the only one, the only member state that has allocated a part of the European structural funds, namely the European Social Fund, to experiment new financing instruments to develop the social investment markets. The idea, on one hand, it was to create and to help social organizations and social entrepreneurs to develop their social innovation projects. And on the other hand, the idea was to create as well to stimulate and help investors to develop their social investment strategies. So the basic idea was to create financing instruments that could promote the approximation, the match between demand and supply. So we created 4 financing instruments that are roughly aligned with the life cycle of a social innovation project, and that simultaneously promotes the partnerships, strategic partnerships between social organizations with new ideas and projects to deal with social problems and investors available to finance them. And please go to the next slide. So these are the 4 financing instruments that we are managing in Portugal. One of them, as you can see, is the social impact bond instrument. I will briefly present each of them for you to understand how they work together. So the first financing instrument, we call it a capacity building for social investment. It's actually a capacity building program that finances not the social innovation project, but development of management skills in the teams that are involved in those social innovation projects. And it's concentrated in financing on-the-job consultancy and pays for deliverables, not for real expenses. Then we have the partnerships for impact. Please, Matthew, go to the next slide. The partnerships for impact is actually a match fund model. We finance 70% of the projects, and the other 30% must be financed by social investors, public or private organizations. Then we have the social impact bonds that I will present in a minute. And finally, we have the Social Innovation Fund. Social Innovation Fund is actually the first financial instrument within the European Social Fund. It aims to address market failures in access to financing by organizations with a social mission. It will work. It's not yet operational. We believe that by the end of the year it will be. and it will work in an hybrid model. We will have an instrument of debt that concedes guarantees for loans and an equity instrument in a deal-by-deal approach in a co-investment model, participation in capital. So let's focus on social impact bonds. I was asked to share with you what were the main challenges and limitations and some recommendations so far. What have we learned? Actually, the main challenge that we face is the main challenge concerning social impact bonds all over. So the main challenge is this, to promote a broad change in culture in 3 sectors at the same time. This is hard, but we have a very enthusiastic environment in Portugal by these days. So where are the main challenges? Well, in the social sector, it's to move from an activity-based strategy to a social outcomes-oriented strategy. That is a challenge that we are facing every day, because they are not, some of the social sector is not used to have this kind of mind frame, and we are working closely with them. In the private sector, we have the challenge of promoting contractualization with the government and to assume and accept the risk associated with social outcomes. That is a changing culture that we must promote as well, and we are doing that closely with some key strategic partners in the field. And in the public sector, of course, we are facing 2 main challenges. First, the challenge of defining desired outcomes in order to open the calls and to decide which are the political priorities and which are the outcomes that are publicly relevant in order to develop a social impact bond. And then, of course, we have a public administration that is not yet organized and used to these pay-for-results mechanisms. So we are doing all of these at the same time. We are working with these 3 sectors in Portugal and trying to develop social impact bonds within the mix of these challenges. So let's pass to the other slide. And in the next slide, I present briefly the financing model that we are using in Portugal. So the impact bonds in Portugal, as you saw, is one of the 4 financing instruments we are managing, and we are using European Social Fund. So the main features of this model are this. So we are looking at innovative projects with measurable social outcomes and that can provide public budget savings. And these projects should be aligned with public policy priorities in areas like employment, social protection, health, education, or justice. Then we have a private organization that implements the project, can be corporations or not-for-profit corporations. We have a social investor that finances the project, a private social investor, and then the public entity that is responsible for the execution of the public policy in that sector that validates the project, the indicators, and the metrics that comes from the central government. So we promote this strategic partnership between the organization that develops the project, the investor, and the public entity, and all of them make the applications in partnerships. We pay, in this case, in Portugal, that is a limitation, as you will see. We pay for real costs. So the outcomes, when the outcomes are met, we don't pay for the outcome itself. We reimburse the investor for the real costs that he had in paying for the project. With European Social Fund, we cannot remunerate the investment. However, in Portugal, we overcome that limitation by creating a tax benefit for social investors. And I believe that Portugal became the second country in the world after the United Kingdom to have a tax benefit for that. And today, in Portugal, the total investment in social impact bonds can be deducted to revenues in a percentage of 130%. It means a 30% tax benefit. That is very close to what we already have for donations. Sorry. Then we go to the other slide, please. And what are the key success factors in our view? First, we have a broad political support in the center of the government. Actually, sorry, the social innovation strategy, as we are developing, it is coordinated at the center of the government by the same ministry who coordinates the innovation and modernization initiatives in public sector. It reinforces a multi-sector vision of the initiative that is not associated exclusively with a specific government area. That is a key factor. Then we have a mission unit responsible for implementing the social innovation public policy. Sorry. And that is very important because when you have a central agency to do that, it concentrates the management of European social funding for social innovation, and it allows for a consistent and comprehensive communication strategy. And a coherent strategy, and actually it's a coherent strategy and an operational central government structure like this one, with a clear mission and means to implement the strategy, is actually an effective way to achieve a real and meaningful change in culture. Then we have close relationships with public entities that validate the project, as I said. We develop strategic partnerships with key players in the market, like Gulbenkian Foundation and other foundations that are key players that inspire other investors. We have an activation team in the field, an activation team that plays a key role in improving regional innovation and social investment. They mobilize public and private entities for joint involvement in social innovation projects. And that is a very important dimension of our project. We have highly qualified and committed intermediaries in the field. That is very important. We couldn't develop social impact bonds in Portugal without that consultants that are in the roots of this project, of this program in Portugal, like maize. And we have that tax incentives, as I said, for social impact bonds. Let me add that today is a very important day in Portugal because today we launched it in the morning, a new platform, the One Value platform, that is an online platform that will provide information on public investments in social services, social services that are considered public policy priorities, and they provide unitary costs for those services. And that will be a reference fundamental for the development of social impact bonds, and hopefully it will allow us to evolve from a real costs reimbursement to pay for outcomes, a real pay for outcomes. This is an online platform that we are developing in the next few months that is already online. Let's move, please. What are the main challenges? First, as I said, mobilize central government and public administration. Second, to promote meaningful partnerships between investors and social organizations. This is a path that we are going, that we are going to develop in the near future. We have to make this match more effective between investors and social organizations. we have actually, of course, to overcome resistance and ignorance in the three sectors for developed social impact bonds. What are the main limitations? The main limitations, first, there is a limited practice of payment for results in public administration. As I said, we have a lack of data to measure outcomes, and we are responding to that limitation with this one value platform. And we have the existence of simpler and less demanding social intervention financing mechanisms. And we have the problem that I said, that European social funding is still mainly based on reimbursement of expenses. Please move. Sorry, I have a cold and I'm having a hard time to overcome it. It's even harder than to develop the social investment market in Portugal. Sorry. Well, main recommendations, as you can see, first, pay for results instead of reimbursing expenses, nothing new. Accept unitary costs data certified by government. That is very important to develop social impact bonds with this model. Simplify and expand the cap for lump sums. That is a limitation with European Social Fund. We cannot develop social impact bonds with projects that go over 100,000 euros. That is a big limitation. Allow municipalities to invest in social impact bonds. Allow longer periods for the implementation of projects. Yes, allow match investment with public entities. That is very important to develop. And this is a technical issue. The coordination of the partnership should be allowed to be for the social organization that is in the partnership. Today is the investor, and sometimes some of the biggest investors are not interested in being the ones to coordinate this partnership and articulate with European Social Fund and the financer. And we should have specific budget for independent social impact assessment as well. Last, I present here the three examples of three SIBs that are now operational in Portugal. We have the Code Academy bootcamps, that is developing a very innovative project with youth unemployment, a 14-week coding bootcamps for unemployed young adults. They negotiated and agreed with the public entity that runs the employment public policy, a metric, a goal of 50% of employment, and they are developing it with success. Then we have the Projeto Família, the family project, as we could say in English. They develop a 6-week intensive support program to families, followed by 12 months ongoing support. Is a project that aims to prevent children from being institutionalized. And they are working with 216 children at risk. Finally, we have the Fast Forward program that also deals with youth unemployment. They develop a 10-month mentoring coaching readiness program, and they negotiated with the public entity a goal of 40% of entry into employment and 20% of the youth that are in the program to maintain the job after 6 months of the program. So these are the three social impact bonds that are now developing in Portugal, and I can say to you that we will have I would say more than 10 in the near future that we are analyzing now, mainly in education. But by the end of the year, I believe that we will have a lot in social inclusion and employment as well. So we are developing this model with all the difficulties that I share with you, and I hope we can overcome them in the near future. Thank you very much to all.
Many thanks, Ms. Almeida, for your explanation, and despite having the cold. It's now time for question and answers. Unfortunately, we're a bit over time, so we will not have time to address all of your questions. But I mean, if you do have any further questions, please feel free to send us an email, and we will certainly follow up with each one of you. I've received several questions from the audience. The first one is for Mr. Philippe Bernard-Treille, and the question goes as follows. So, by supporting certain outcome funds over others, investors effectively make decisions about the allocation of public goods. What happens to policy expertise in outcome-based financing, as traditionally public authority would be tasked with designing programs and prioritizing outcomes? Therefore, how do investors make sound investment decisions, and how can be decision-making processes be more fact-based and ethically balanced? This question is for you, Mr. Philippe Bernard-Treille, but I mean, all the other speakers, please feel free to chip in and comment.
Thank you very much for the question. So first, on the first part of the question, I think it's clearly a complementary tool for developing and brainstorming on how new methodology could be implemented and help the public sector. On the second part of the question relating to how investment decisions are made, I think what is very crucial, let's say, when you launch and when you assess social outcome contract, is clearly the first how it is structured. You know, who has structured it, and also what is the track record of the social sector organization, which is gonna basically deliver this intervention, and this is one of the main elements, because it's the rationale on which you're gonna take your investment decision. So of course, so you need to be super selective in that. The service provider, it needs to have expertise in what they do. They should be really focused on the outcome. They need to have that capacity to deliver the mission. Of course, the management, of course, should be able to do that, to promise, and because when you set up an outcome contract, basically you are sort of an united front between investors, commissioner, and service provider, and the commissioning of this contract needs to be fits all the expectation. Of course, what the government doesn't want to engage with something which could eventually fail, particularly when you launch pilots. So that's why, actually, if you manage to be selective in the service provider, then I believe that this could be produce what is needed in terms of outcome. I don't know if it's answer your question, but maybe some other panelists would like to add something.
Many thanks, Mr. Bernard-Treille. I bet Ms. Efremova would like to add something.
Yes, thank you very much. Just to complement what Philippe was saying, the allocation of public goods essentially rests with the public sector, with the public commissioner, who establishes a call for outcomes. So the public sector still sets the policy priorities. And if you take just a bigger picture view, the scarcity of budgets or of funding is mostly on the side of the public sector. Okay, so there is no, to put it bluntly, there is no shortage of investors, I think, willing to intervene for different social impact schemes. So it's not the case that investors would select to invest in certain funds over others, and then at the end, some public priorities won't be funded. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Efremova. Jane, would you like to add something to this question?
Only very briefly to say that an outcomes fund is a commissioning tool, so it will fund in areas that the public sector wants to fund, as both Philippe and Georgia have said. I think the only observation around investors I would add is that where the public sector does decide to commission for outcomes in this way and relies on investors to pre-fund programs, clearly they need to be satisfied that what they're putting forward is something that is of interest to investors. But it's very much public sector first, then investor.
Thank you very much, Ms. Newman, for adding also this comment. I have a question now for all panelists, so feel free to jump in. There's also a question that we received from the audience, and the question is, what seems to be, from governing standpoint, acceptable cost for impact measurement and validation that would then trigger outcome payments? Perhaps Jane?
I'm not sure that I properly understand the question.
Yeah.
So the question basically is how much of the money of the whole contract should be going into impact measurement? What's the percentage of the total contract that is acceptable percentage to do impact measurement and measurement? And I think the question comes from the fact that there is a perception of social impact bonds and outcome contracting of being very complex and very expensive. So at which level would you find it efficient over at the traditional provision of a grant or equity? I think that ties into a broader question on efficiency.
Well, I don't think we think about it in terms of percentage of contracts, but that's obviously a relevant factor. If you were doing a small contract and you're having to measure, but you could be doing a larger contract with a larger cohort of people involving essentially the same resources to measure, you would have the percentages would be different. So I think that's the problem with it. We tend to think about it in terms of the resource that you need to deploy to measure, and that's basically set up costs, which diminish over time as we all understand what the appropriate measurement methodology is, and then the performance management oversight. If you put in place a relatively complex measurement structure like randomized control trial or something like that, your costs will be more. But from a policy perspective, there may be a value in doing that. So I think that it's nice to think there's a one-size-fits-all answer to this question, but I think it is a bit more nuanced than that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Any other speakers that would like to add anything on this? Okay, if not, I have... Sorry?
No, Philippe Bernard speaking. I think what we see it differs really according to what type of intervention, and what is the size, of your outcome contract, and how you want to structure it. But there is one at the moment, and it's let's say, first, it's, as Jane said, it's part of the step cost, and also this investors are paying for that. Of course, ultimately it's repaid by the outcome fund, but it's something which is in line with. It's not a huge amount when you enter into transactions. What we see, we have a short-term contract at the moment. It's around 5 million euros, and the measurement is around 60,000 euros.
Thank you, Mr. Bernard for complementing the question. Perhaps, I have another question for Mr. Almeida. The question I received, again, this question from the audience, and the question is, can outcome funds be used for any thematic area in an efficient and effective way?
Okay, thank you very much. I will answer that question in a second. Let me just make 2 comments on the other 2 questions. The first is that actually the first concern that was about how the money will go to public policy priorities in Portugal. As I said, the applications, the social impact bonds are only approved after the public policy entity validates the relevance of that project. However, as I said, we are launching the One Value platform, and in that platform, we are including a list of public policy priorities. So the projects and the investors can in advance orient their projects to the public policy priorities. And of course that in Portugal, we are using social impact bonds to experiment new ideas, new approaches to solve social problems. So it will not substitute the public policy budget in those social services. It's for experimenting new approaches and to integrate public policy in the near future if it is successful. That's the whole idea. Concerning the second question, actually, we have to have a quantitative measurable reference of the public savings, the potential public savings concerning the project, in order to see how much will be should be expanded also in assessing the results. And that reference, we are developing this platform, this One Value platform, actually to have a reasonable reference to how much does this outcome costs in public policy expenditure. Of course, that's an heuristic. It's not an absolute value, but is a reference in order to do that. Concerning the last question, I would say that social impact bonds, actually, they are directed to social projects that can provide social results, measurable social results. Not all innovative programs have, of course, measurable results in the short run. But I would say that in almost any area we can have evidences that we achieved a good social outcome. So today in Portugal, we are developing social impact bonds in 6 different areas of public policy: social protection, health, employment, justice and social inclusion, and digital inclusion. But we can develop in other areas. I would say that generally, yes, I think social impact bonds can apply to almost any area of public policy.
Thank you, Mr. Almeida, for answering 2 questions. And thanks to all panelists for their insightful presentation. I'm afraid that we are running out of time, and I'm sorry to interrupt such an interesting discussion. I would like to thank also all the participants for the question and attention. I'm happy to remind you that this webinar will be available on our website, together with the speaker's presentation and the recording. The VPA policy team is also writing a policy brief on the topic and will be shared with you all. Please do not hesitate to check all our previous policy webinar on our website. Information about our next webinar will follow shortly. And of course, if you have any sort of question about this webinar or this topic, feel free to write us an email. And on behalf of all EVPA team, I thank you again, and I wish you a very nice day.